Unmute and you can talk. Over to you.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today on privacy compliance for hotel digital marketing. I understand that some of you may think that privacy is quite a complex issue, but I would like to help you give you some practical guidance in terms of privacy compliance. And hopefully during today's session, you will get some insights about how to help your business and also in your digital marketing efforts with privacy compliance in mind as well. So let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Andrew. I am the Assistant Director of Data, Privacy and Digital Payments for Minor Hotels based in Bangkok. I'm sorry I cannot join you guys in person today in Phuket, but I do hope that you're having a lovely time during the conference. So I have been in my role for nearly 4 years now, and I am a certified information privacy manager. And I also volunteer for our local chapter of the IAPP as a young privacy professional. So you may ask, what is the IAPP? So let me just give you a brief introduction. So it is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and it's an organization that was established in 2000 to really give some support and guidance for the emerging privacy professionals at the time. And what IAPP has done is they have built a really strong community of people who are engaged in privacy work and given us some platforms and forums in order to share knowledge, which is really important for privacy. What is also great about IAPP is they have some really useful resources that are available for free. Anyone can access them. So if you want to learn a little bit more about privacy, I would encourage you to log on to their website, iapp.org, and just have a look at what's available out there. There's some really great information. Apart from that, they also do have certifications, which are designed not just for lawyers or IT professionals, but people like me who are implementing privacy programs on an operational basis and also to support business objectives. And they have been a really good resource in expanding my privacy knowledge. And so it's a really well-trusted organization. So enough about IAPP, let's dive right into talking about privacy. So just to give you some context, here are some of the global privacy regulations that are currently in force around the world. So this is just a sample of them. And you'll see one of the most well-known or famous ones is the GDPR from Europe, which has really served as the blueprint of privacy laws for other countries, such as the one that we have in Thailand, which is the PDPA. And you'll also see that there are some quite heavy fines and penalties for organizations that don't comply with these regulations. Now, I don't mean for this to scare you. It's more so that you have a reference to understand that there are more and more countries that are implementing privacy regulations. And we see that it's because there are consumers' expectations which are changing. People are more aware of their personal data, and especially in our current world, which is driven by the data technology and economy. We are seeing more and more new technologies that are using personal data that we're still a little bit behind in terms of being able to regulate and really understand what is the impact of such technologies. So when you're looking at things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, facial recognition, these are all new technologies that could have very harmful effects on people if falling into the wrong hands. And so that's why there are more and more countries that are interested in introducing this type of regulation. And what I hope to do is also help you translate some of these regulations into actions. And what's also the good news is that for companies that implement a privacy program, they do see a return on this investment. So Cisco did a study in 2020, and they found that companies that had a robust privacy program actually generated 2.7 times the ROI on this investment. So you may ask, how does that come about? Well, privacy programs are able to achieve a number of things. Firstly, it does build loyalty and trust with your customers. And as we know, customers that trust you and are loyal to you obviously spend more money with you. We also know that privacy programs make companies more attractive to investors. So if you're on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, for example, they have questions about your privacy program. And so that will then support how attractive you are to shareholders. We also see operational efficiency gains from having strong data controls, because obviously knowing where your personal data sits can make you more efficient. It allows better agility and innovation because having a strong understanding of privacy and the use of data in a lawful way allows you to innovate and create new products and services catered to your customers. And lastly, we can't forget about data breaches. So a strong privacy program will help you mitigate those losses and avoid you from ending up in headlines from an embarrassing data breach. So from a practical perspective, what can you do as a digital marketer? So there are 5 main things that I will go through with you in a little bit more detail today, and I'll go through them one by one. So let's get started with getting to know your data. So in the previous HSMAI ROC webinar on the role of digital marketing, this was touched on by Carolina from Assembly Global. And she said that as digital marketers, we need to focus on what we can control. And one of those things is to build and leverage first-party data. And so what does that actually mean? What is first-party data? So we'll start with some definitions. So when we look at data, there is firstly personal data. So personal data is anything that can identify a person by itself. So simply say your name is personal data. Now we can also identify personal data as any piece of data that if we combine with another identifier can then be attributed back to you. So say, for example, email behavior, where you click on an email, what links you try to access, that in itself may not be necessarily personal data, but then if we combine it with the database of the email addresses or your IP address, then it becomes personal data. Secondly, then, what is first-party data? So first-party data is any information that you as an organization or a company collects directly from the individual or the data subject. So this could be data about your customers, but also your employees, your vendors, your shareholders, etc. And some examples of this may be data that is sitting in your PMS, or for example, the marketing consent that you have collected. And then lastly, we should talk about special category or sensitive data. So this is data that poses a high risk, and so we must protect it from being made publicly available. And so these special category data may be specified by a regulation such as GDPR in terms of health data. So as hoteliers, we might be collecting the health data of our guests, for example, their allergies, right, in order to provide service. And so when we use this data, we must collect it with, explicit consent, and we must make an extra effort to protect it. Another piece of, say, sensitive data may be credit cards. So credit cards fall as part of personal data, but also there are industry regulations such as PCI DSS. So when we're working with credit card data, we need to be aware of, this double whammy that we need to comply both with the industry standards, but also as a piece of personal data from a privacy regulation perspective. So how do you know what first-party data you have? Well, actually, as part of many privacy regulations, one of the requirements that you need to do as a company is to do what we call data inventory mapping. So this is finding out about, who has access to the data, the personal data that you hold, what types of data do you have, what format is it in, where is it being stored, how are you using it, how risky is the processing, and why do you need it? So how can you justify processing it with a lawful basis? And that is because you really can't protect what you don't know. So by doing this data mapping, you are then killing two birds with one stone, because you are both being compliant by really understanding what's happening with personal data in your business, but then you're also able to then identify these are all the data points that you hold and where is it being stored. So then you can come up with a strategy on how to utilize this data better. So when we talk about these first-party data and when you're using it, there are some considerations that I would recommend you take in mind. So you may think, okay, well, what happens if I don't have the data that I need? What is reasonable for me to collect? Well, you need to think about it from a principles perspective, which is all the data that you collect, it should serve a purpose, right? So you need to be able to justify the purpose and the use of this data. And additionally, you should also think, does it fall under one of the legal bases that is allowed for you to process this data under the regulation, right? So if you look at it, say, from a common sense point of view, if I book a hotel room and you ask me about, what is my annual income, is that really reasonable? So I think we would say no in this instance. And so we just need to make, a bit of a common sense judgment in that regards. Secondly, I think everyone needs to understand, is your data accessible for your business purposes? So whether it is, being able to do marketing and customer segmentation, whether you want to have it in your BI, analytics and dashboards, where is your data being stored? Who has access to it, right? Have you thought about, centralizing your data? So for example, building a data lake or a data warehouse where your data can then be used by your business people. And then lastly, I think everyone should have a think, long term, what is your data management and governance strategy, right? Is this a discipline that is in place within your organization? And we can see now that there are experts and partners that can actually guide us in the industry in order to be able to utilize the data that we hold better. And there are some data companies that specialize in the hospitality industry. So for example, Happy or HostQ are just some that may be able to broaden your data strategy and allow you to utilize first-party data better than before. So the second topic I'd like to talk about is direct marketing. And we can't talk about direct marketing without going deep into talking about consent, right? So under GDPR and many other regulations, there is a specific definition about what consent should look like. So firstly, it needs to be an affirmative act. An affirmative act means that we should be using tick boxes, buttons, asking someone to sign something. That is now pretty much standard practice when it comes to collecting consent. And the second component is that it needs to be freely given, right? So is this consent genuine? And what we recommend is that it should really be unbundled from unrelated things. So for example, if you ask someone, oh, you have to give me market consent, otherwise you can't book a room, that's not really reasonable. You should be allowed to book a stay without signing up to marketing, because these are two different purposes. And so in that situation, we wouldn't consider that freely given consent, because you're kind of held hostage to wanting to use the service or product. But what we do say is that you can use some incentives to ask people to consent to your marketing, maybe in the form of, say, like a special promotion or a discount, for example. Another part of the definition is that this consent needs to be specific. So we need to be exact in telling people what are they consenting to, right? We should try and avoid consent creep. So if someone gives you consent for marketing, we can't just decide, oh, now I'm going to also enroll you in our loyalty program, because that would be going beyond what the person agreed to in the beginning. Consent also needs to be informed. So this needs information about what they're consenting to, who has access to this consent. This needs to be given either in a written or verbal format. And lastly, it needs to be unambiguous, which means that, inaction or implied consent is not really good form. So when we say someone, oh, by not doing anything, you're agreeing to giving consent, that's not really valid consent anymore. And so what are some of those best practices for this direct marketing? Well, we would firstly need to look at, what is your choice of communication platform? So when you choose, say, an email system, does it capture consent sufficiently? Right? Is the consent granular enough for your purposes? For example, does it separate consent, by your brands or perhaps the interest of the customer? And you can look at platforms that may be consolidated, where consent is combined with the actual sending of the communication, like MailChimp. Or you may take a separated approach where you have an independent consent management platform, for example, OneTrust. Another thing that you should consider is the ease of unsubscribing from your mailing list. So do you put links in your email templates, right? If someone reaches out to your team members directly in your customer care teams or your marketing teams, are they able to exercise that right? And because this is a data subject request, and so this is now something that is required and you must do. And there have been companies that have been fined because they have not been able to allow people to be unsubscribed from marketing. And you also need to consider perhaps not just your email marketing campaigns, but what about SMS or any other mediums? So this is something to take into consideration. You should also be reviewing your touch points. So what are the places across the customer journey that you're able to capture consent? So are there additional opportunities, say, for when people contact your reservations team, for you to then collect consent for marketing? And what is then the process to capture it? And then lastly, I think consent does need to be proven. So you need to keep records. So when regulators show up at your door, you need to be able to demonstrate proof that someone gave you consent for this marketing. So I know that in the past, hotels may have a fishbowl where they collect, business cards, and they think that, you can automatically start emailing these people with offers. Well, that's not really consent just because someone dropped a business card in a fishbowl, for example. So you need to think of, what are the other mechanisms that you can put in place to then collect that consent. And as I touched on briefly, the right to object to marketing is a data subject right. And here are some other rights that are covered under the regulation. And what I would recommend is you have to set up a process in order to handle these rights, because people are starting to make these requests of organizations. So moving on to website privacy. So there are three things I want to touch on, which is privacy notices, cataloging your input fields and forms, and then the use of cookies. Now, it's important to have a privacy notice or statement on your website. And there are many elements to such a statement. In fact, there are templates that have come out from a lot of the regulators about what needs to be included in your statement. A lot of this information that you to put in there will come from the data mapping exercise. So by doing data mapping, you are then able to then complete your privacy notice. Now, it's good to bear in mind that this is a legal document. So I highly recommend that you get legal advice when you draft such a notice, because then you will be held accountable for it. Aside from that, it's also important for you to review your website, because this is where you're able to collect, quite a significant amount of first-party data, in particular during, the bookings process or an inquiries process. So this would be where you should be thinking, are you collecting the information that you need in a lawful way? Secondly, this is where many many organizations collect their consent for marketing. So then, are you collecting this consent following the consent requirements which I shared with you earlier? You also should consider the communication of this consent information. So is the information in an understandable format about, specifically what are people consenting to? Are they going to get emails? Are they going to get SMS messages? From who is it coming from? So all this relevant information needs to be given to the data subjects. And then furthermore, this is also where you collect payment data. So are you still, in the habit of asking people to send in their credit card details in an email with, a photocopy of the card and their ID or passport? This is now, reaching what is, allowable within the privacy space, but also from the PCI DSS compliance point of view. So I would highly recommend, using, say, a payment gateway, making sure that, any messages that are containing the data is encrypted during transit or at rest, and making sure this information is, either hashed or tokenized. Okay. And finally, let's talk about some cookies. So we need to allow people to understand what kind of cookies are being used for monitoring or tracking purposes. Do you categorize your cookies in an understandable manner so that people know what the cookies are for, and then they would be more inclined to accept consent for it? You should also display a cookie banner in order to collect this consent, because this consent for cookies needs to be explicit. And it would be best practice to allow self-service cookie management. So for people to be able to enable and disable cookies based on their preferences. And additionally, the cookie information also needs to be provided. So this is an important part of the disclosure process. Moving on to social media. Now, when you're using, for example, user-generated content, this is considered personal data. And so it would be in your best interest to get consent from people before you are, reposting their content. And I would say, just ask, because most creators rarely say no, because they are also, inclined to build their following and share, what they're posting on, Instagram or Facebook. If you're collecting images and video during events, it would be good practice to have some signage telling people that you're doing so, because it would be impossible for you to get consent from everyone who attends your event. And in the absence of signage, you can also consider putting it in the invitations that you send out to events, or doing both, just to make sure that you're covered. And obviously, if you are using this content to form part of your permanent marketing materials and content, I would then recommend, using release forms, especially for, models and influencers, just to make sure that, you don't land in hot water without getting their consent. And additionally, for social media DMs and engagement, I would include some privacy language in the auto replies that you send to people, just to give them a heads up about what their personal data is being used for. And as we know, social media channels aren't the most secure channels. Accounts are easily hacked through phishing efforts. So I would recommend moving the conversation to either email or phone call or other channels where possible when you're confirming some private details of the guest. And so lastly, it's about bringing everyone on board. Every privacy program needs a team, and you need to get experts from legal, from risk and compliance, from HR, from IT. You can't do it alone. It needs to be a team effort, and you need to get this collaboration. And people really are our greatest asset, but also our weakest link when it comes to data privacy. So it's really important to develop a training and awareness program for your employees. And this can start with some baseline training so that everyone gets a good understanding of privacy at a basic level. And then you can then focus on more specific roles like people in marketing or IT. And I would recommend communicating constantly using things like posters, newsletters, announcements, just so that it stays top of mind and awareness is built over time. So not everyone has the time and effort to become a privacy expert, and I understand that. So what I would say is, if you understand the principles behind the data privacy regulation, it will help you come a long way into implementing some good data privacy practices. So you can review the principles that are outlined in GDPR as a good starting point. Because at the end of the day, we want to build trust with our customers. As much as it is about avoiding those, steep fines and regulations, it is also about how can you advance your organization, how can you use personal data to your advantage by making sure that you build trust with the customer. Because when they hand you their data, it is then your responsibility to make sure that it is protected. And so just to sum up, these are the 5 things that I think as digital marketers, you need to focus on, is getting to know your data. And by getting to know it, then you know what is the first party data that you have to use to do your personalized marketing campaigns, etc. When you're doing direct marketing, making sure that you're aware of the consent requirements and that you're following them. For your website privacy, it's making sure that you have the privacy notice, that you have the cookies, that you know where data is being collected. And then for social media, the use of user-generated content, and for DMs and engagement. And then lastly, the importance of teamwork. So bringing everyone on board so that you're on the same page. So I hope you found this session helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That was great. What sort of questions has everyone got? It might be too late in the day for questions. You got any? You can ask Andrew really hard, detailed questions.
I've got a question.
He's good at really hard, detailed questions. Andrew, yeah.
Andrew, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Hi, Andrew. I think I've asked you so many questions already. No. I just have my question is like, how urgent is it that hotels really need to be? I mean, have you heard of anyone getting fined in Thailand for any kind of privacy breaches yet in the hotel industry and that type of thing? I mean, it's active now, right? So we should be following privacy protocols now.
The EU ones definitely, but
yeah. So yeah. In what sense of it? What level of urgency should we be looking at?
Right. So specifically for Thailand, the regulation was enforced from the 1st of June. What we do know is that the government regulator that is enforcing the law is still a little bit underprepared. They're still trying to recruit experts, for example, to handle the type of complaints that they're going to have to deal with when people start asking those, hard questions and start filing complaints. And so at this time, they're taking more of a reactive approach rather than proactive when it comes to investigating the data privacy practices of organizations. In saying that though, this is time to really get prepared because they are ramping up. They're starting to issue sub-regulations, which is the next step down from the main law, which is providing more detailed guidance about what you need to do. And then they're probably going to start issuing more specific instructions on top of that as well. So I don't think,
in a sense, it's coming, it's here. I mean, you really do need to start factoring that into all plans going forward, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's something that you need to really start doing now. So because by the time that you're being contacted by the regulator, it will be too late.
And do you know, I'm not sure, I haven't never asked any, maybe I'll ask some of the guys here, but is everyone in hotels, have they appointed like a volunteer, like you've been appointed for minor from a corporate perspective, but do minor hotels have an appointed like volunteer in each hotel that is kind of connects with you on the privacy issues and that type of thing?
So I think we started with a centralized approach where we're focusing on it like from a corporate corporate office standpoint, and then we're starting to build up our network of people on the ground at each of the hotels. Yeah. So everyone in our hotels have received training about privacy, right? So all frontline staff members, so they have some cursory knowledge around it, and we're starting to build up specific experts in each of the hotels.
Yeah. And we used to do that. I mean, we did that with ISG when they had, early on in the loyalty program, because it was being misinterpreted in the hotels. We had a loyalty champion in each hotel, and that developed into a whole program in the end. That there was always a loyalty champion in each property that understood all the T's and C's and how to use it in depth. So I assume the same is going to happen with privacy, right? There'll be someone on site who is the one that is the go-to person for like the legislation and that type of thing. Like operationally what to do in certain situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And we find that usually that person is maybe like the front office manager, for example, because they are the people who are in touch with a lot of personal data during their day-to-day.
Sure.
Have other hotels got anybody working on privacy
yes, we
and
have.
first party? Do you? Yeah.
Yes, financial controller, me, in terms of revenues, and room division managers.
Right.
And we talk together many times and then send the report to GM.
Well, I have a question
That's
for you though.
interesting, yeah.
That is really, and other hotels as well. You're all starting to have someone on site that is dealing with the privacy.
Person assigned on site, I need to recheck, but we went through all of the PDPA with like independent
Right.
departmental
They have their own
trainings and
responsibility.
representatives that call and
Right,
do
that's
it
good.
by
Sales and
departments.
marketing, they're gonna have the paper shredder machine.
Right.
Like every time when you finish the contract or some things about, important
It's all
information we have to
protocols.
describe, we have to put in that machine.
Yeah.
That's what I have.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Anyone else doing something
I
or
just
not
got one
start?
question too. So from this presentation, because we worked with Andrew, there's been a few variations of this presentation. And when I saw this last one, I mean, for me, when I saw it fresh, I came in late in the process, but it was just so clear. I thought it was such a good presentation on privacy and how to really quickly understand it.
Yes.
My thing is the GM could sit down for 15, 20 minutes and in 15, 20 minutes understand the fabric of what privacy is, what he needs to do and stuff. So
Yeah.
did you get that feeling listening to Andrew? It was very clear and easy to follow.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go, Andrew.
It's exactly us like when I have training.
All right.
Yeah,
Did you- was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
we have online
Easier.
training for the property and
Yes.
financial.
Oh,
They have
financial.
that
Right.
This
protection
one
training.
is easier for understanding than the one we did before.
Oh, okay, there you go, Andrew. It's easier
Good,
to
well done.
understand than some of the
Easier
ones
to
we've done
digest.
before.
Well, we
There you
can
go.
send you, it's on Zoom, so we recorded it, so we can send you a link if you want to show any,
Yeah,
if you feel like you need to show anyone.
Because we want to sort of get something that sort of GM can look at and not sort of switch off to, then sit through it and go, oh, okay, I've got a good understanding of what your need, what you need to go through to implement it, if he's not behind it. But I thought it was an excellent presentation.
Yeah, okay, Andrew, anyone else got a question or thought?
What the difference between our law like PDPA, the big difference between PDPA and GDPA compliant?
You mean B2B?
PDPA.
Oh, yeah, PDPA. I'll put you closer. Yeah.
What do you
Good
see
plan.
is the big difference between PDPA and GDPA compliant?
Did you hear, Andrew?
So the difference between PDPA and GDPR. Yeah.
Oh, right.
So the two regulations are very, very similar. You could, in some places you could almost see that, PDPA was like a copy and paste from GDPR. So the main differences are in just kind of more specific details, like for example, the fines that are given, for example, the fact that, PDPA has a jail term of 1 year for, directors of the company if they're found to be, not compliant. So there's some small details, but I think, in terms of the principles, it's pretty much the same. It's about making sure that the processing of the data is lawful, you're being transparent, you're being held accountable for it, not over collecting data, and you're storing it securely. I think these elements are pretty much in line with what GDPR is going for as well.
Okay, that makes it a little bit easier because at least you're used to GDPR then. Anything else? No more?
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
I do have LinkedIn, so if you want to add me, please do.
But it's actually virtually impossible to find Andrew Lee on LinkedIn because there's a lot of people with that name. You might have more luck because you're in Thailand. And I tried to look him up in Australia. I was just, nah. I give in. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. And I know we spent a lot of time putting this together, so thanks for the extra time making it really easy to understand.
Really hoping that it does help people. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.